My name is Emma Williams, and at 26, I never expected to be standing outside a law office in downtown Phoenix, listening through the window as my Aunt Jennifer smugly announced to the entire room, "Well, that's what happens when you abandon family. Emma gets nothing." And we made sure Grandma Rose knew exactly who really cared about her. The satisfied murmur of agreement from my cousins made my stomach clench, but what they didn't know was that 3 hours earlier I'd received a call from my bank about an unexpected deposit that had appeared in my account overnight. A very large, very unexpected deposit that would change everything they thought they knew about my grandmother's final wishes. If you've ever been the black sheep of your family, the one who dared to dream beyond the boundaries they set for you, then you'll understand exactly how I felt in that moment. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding my relationship with Grandma Rose means understanding why her final gift was so much more than money. It was validation, protection, and proof that sometimes the people who love us most see things that everyone else misses. I grew up in suburban Denver, Colorado, in a family where conformity was considered a virtue, and ambition beyond our small world was seen as betrayal. The Williams family had deep roots in rural Colorado, stretching back 4 generations to when my great-great-grandfather homesteaded a farm outside of a tiny town called Millfield. For decades, the family had followed the same pattern: graduate high school, work the family businesses, marry young, stay close to home, and repeat the cycle. My childhood was comfortable but predictable. Dad worked construction with his brother Mike. Mom taught at the local elementary school, and every Sunday we'd gather at Grandma Rose's farmhouse for dinner, where 3 generations would crowd around her massive oak dining table that had belonged to her mother. The house always smelled like fresh bread and lavender from the herb garden she tended with religious devotion. Grandma Rose was the undisputed matriarch of our family, and everyone deferred to her wisdom. She'd raised 5 children after Grandpa died young, somehow managing to keep the farm profitable while working as the town's only bookkeeper. Even as I got older, I marveled at how she could balance complex financial records by hand, her neat columns of numbers always perfectly accurate. As a child, I was the golden daughter everyone pointed to with pride. I earned straight A's without trying, devoured every book in our small-town library, and had an insatiable curiosity about how things worked. While my cousins spent summers swimming and playing video games, I'd follow Grandma Rose around the farm, pestering her with endless questions about everything from why her tomatoes grew better than the neighbors, to how she decided which stocks to buy for her small investment account. Most adults would have grown tired of my constant questions, but Grandma Rose seemed to thrive on them. She'd explain compound interest using the growth of her vegetable garden as an example, or teach me about supply and demand by showing me how she timed the sale of her farm produce to get the best prices. These weren't formal lessons, just conversations between a curious child and a grandmother who treated my questions with the same seriousness she'd give to an adult. When I was 14, I announced that I wanted to be an engineer. The reaction from most of my family was polite but skeptical. Engineering was something other people did, people from big cities with college-educated parents. The Williams family produced farmers, construction workers, teachers, and small business owners. We were practical, hardworking people who kept their feet firmly planted on the ground. But Grandma Rose's eyes lit up when I told her about my dreams. She'd been quietly observing my fascination with how things worked, my habit of taking apart broken appliances to understand their mechanisms, and my natural aptitude for mathematics that went far beyond what my small-town school could nurture. That evening, she pulled me aside on her front porch swing, the same spot where we'd had countless important conversations over the years. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed to stretch forever across the Colorado plains. "Emma, sweetheart," she said, her weathered hands folding over mine, "I want you to know something important. There's a big difference between dreaming small because you're scared and dreaming small because you're satisfied. You've got the kind of mind that needs big challenges, and there's nothing wrong with that." She went on to tell me something I'd never heard before about her own youth. Before she married Grandpa, she'd wanted to go to college and study mathematics. In 1960, that was an unusual ambition for a farm girl from rural Colorado, and her parents had gently but firmly steered her toward more traditional expectations. She'd made peace with the path her life took, she assured me, but she'd always wondered what might have been possible if she'd had the courage to pursue her original dreams. "I don't want you to spend your life wondering," she said firmly. "If you want to be an engineer, then you're going to be an engineer. We'll figure out how to make it happen." From that moment forward, Grandma Rose became my secret ally in ways the rest of the family never fully understood. She helped me research universities with strong engineering programs, drove me to college fairs in Denver when my parents couldn't take time off work, and somehow always had money available for the application fees and test prep materials that we couldn't quite afford on Dad's construction worker salary. During my senior year of high school, when I was accepted to Colorado State University with a partial scholarship that would cover tuition but not living expenses, it was Grandma Rose who quietly made up the difference. She never made a big announcement about it, never sought credit or gratitude. She simply handed me an envelope one Sunday after dinner and said, "This is an investment in the future." College was everything I'd dreamed it would be and more challenging than I'd imagined. The engineering program was rigorous, and I found myself competing with classmates who'd attended elite preparatory schools and had access to resources I'd never even known existed. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed by the gap between my small-town background and the sophisticated world I was trying to enter. But every week, without fail, Grandma Rose would call to check on my progress. She'd ask detailed questions about my coursework, want to know about the projects I was working on, and somehow always knew exactly what to say when I was struggling with a particularly difficult concept or feeling homesick for the familiar rhythms of small-town life. During my sophomore year, when I was taking my first computer programming class, I tried to explain to her how fascinating I found the logic of coding, the way complex problems could be broken down into elegant solutions. I expected her to listen politely but not really understand, the way most of my family did when I talked about my studies. Instead, she surprised me by asking specific questions that showed she was following every detail. A few days later, she called to tell me she'd bought her first computer and was teaching herself to use the internet. At 75 years old, Grandma Rose was learning to navigate the digital world because she wanted to better understand what I was passionate about. The family thought it was amusing, this elderly farm woman struggling with email and web browsers, but I recognized it for what it really was. Unconditional support from someone who loved me enough to step outside her comfort zone to stay connected to my world. During my junior year, I made a decision that would ultimately change everything. I'd been selected for a summer internship at a renewable energy startup in Seattle, a company that was developing new solar panel technology that could potentially revolutionize clean energy production. It was an incredible opportunity, the kind of experience that could open doors to a career I'd only dreamed about. But it meant spending the summer 3 states away, instead of coming home to work at Uncle Mike's construction company, where I'd spent every previous summer since high school. The family saw this as ingratitude, a rejection of their values and the practical experience they'd always emphasized. When I called Grandma Rose to tell her about the internship, I was prepared for disappointment, or at least gentle discouragement. Instead, her voice filled with excitement that matched my own. "Oh, Emma, this sounds absolutely wonderful. Tell me everything about this company and what you'll be doing." I spent an hour describing the technology, the potential environmental impact, and the career possibilities the internship might create. She listened to every word, asking thoughtful questions and expressing genuine enthusiasm for opportunities she couldn't fully comprehend, but recognized as important to my future. That summer in Seattle was transformative. I worked alongside brilliant engineers and scientists who were tackling some of the world's most pressing environmental challenges. The company culture was unlike anything I'd experienced, with an emphasis on innovation, collaboration, and the belief that technology could be a force for positive change in the world. But more than the professional experience, that summer showed me what was possible when you stepped beyond the boundaries of familiar expectations. I'd found my tribe, people who shared my passion for solving complex problems, and who saw ambition as a virtue rather than a character flaw. When I returned home at the end of the summer, the contrast was jarring. My family was politely interested in my stories about Seattle, but I could sense their underlying concern that I was moving too far from the values and lifestyle they cherished. There were subtle comments about the importance of staying grounded, of not forgetting where I came from, of remembering that family should always come first. Only Grandma Rose seemed to understand that my horizons had expanded in ways that wouldn't easily contract back to their original size. During one of our porch conversations, she observed quietly, "You're different now, sweetheart. You've seen what's possible, and there's no going back from that kind of knowledge." She was right, and I think we both knew that my path was leading away from the familiar rhythms of small-town Colorado life. But instead of trying to hold me back, she encouraged me to keep moving forward, to trust my instincts even when they led me into unfamiliar territory. During my senior year, when job offers started coming in, I faced the decision that would define my relationship with my family for years to come. I had two main options: a position with a respected engineering firm in Denver that would allow me to stay close to home, or an offer from the same Seattle startup where I'd interned, now offering me a full-time position working on cutting-edge renewable energy projects. The Denver job was safe, predictable, and would make my family happy. The Seattle position was risky, challenging, and represented everything I'd been working toward for 4 years. The choice should have been easy, but I was torn between my dreams and my deep love for my family. It was Grandma Rose who helped me find clarity. During one of our late-night phone conversations, she shared something she'd never told anyone else in the family. For decades, she'd been quietly investing small amounts of money in companies she researched and believed in. Her approach was unconventional for someone of her generation and background, focusing on businesses that aligned with her values rather than simply seeking maximum returns. "I've been watching this renewable energy sector you're so passionate about," she told me. "I think you're right about its potential, and I think you'd be making a mistake to settle for safe when you have a chance to be part of something revolutionary." Her confidence in my judgment gave me the courage to accept the Seattle position, even knowing it would disappoint and possibly anger my family. The reaction was everything I'd feared: hurt feelings, accusations of ingratitude, and subtle but persistent pressure to reconsider my decision. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But through it all, Grandma Rose remained my unwavering supporter. She defended my choice in family discussions, celebrated my successes during our weekly phone calls, and somehow always knew exactly what I needed to hear when the isolation and criticism from other family members became overwhelming. The distance between Seattle and Colorado was more than geographical. With each passing month, I felt myself growing further from the family dynamics I'd always known, developing new perspectives and priorities that seemed increasingly foreign to my relatives back home. There were times when I wondered if I'd made a mistake, if the cost of pursuing my dreams was too high when measured against the family relationships I was sacrificing. But Grandma Rose never let me doubt that I'd made the right choice. Her belief in me became the foundation that allowed me to weather the criticism and build a new life based on my own values rather than inherited expectations. She understood something that the rest of my family couldn't see: that real love means supporting someone's growth even when it takes them far from where you want them to be. My first apartment in Seattle was a tiny studio in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, barely large enough for a bed, desk, and the hot plate I used to make ramen noodles and scrambled eggs. The rent consumed nearly half my entry-level salary, but I could walk to work through Pike Place Market, where the energy of the city seemed to pulse through every street corner. The contrast between this vibrant urban environment and the quiet predictability of rural Colorado was jarring at first, but gradually I began to thrive in the complexity and possibility that surrounded me. The renewable energy startup, called Solar Tech Innovations, operated out of a converted warehouse in the Soto district. The office was everything you'd expect from a young tech company: exposed brick walls, standing desks made from reclaimed wood, and a coffee bar that served locally roasted beans strong enough to fuel 16-hour workdays. But beneath the trendy startup aesthetic was serious work that felt more important than anything I'd ever been part of. My role as a junior engineer involved optimizing the efficiency of photovoltaic cells, work that required both technical precision and creative problem-solving. The team I joined was small but brilliant, led by Dr. Sarah Martinez, a former MIT professor who'd left academia to commercialize her research into next-generation solar technology. Sarah became my first real professional mentor, someone who challenged me to think beyond conventional approaches and encouraged the kind of innovative thinking that had always gotten me in trouble in more traditional environments. During those early months in Seattle, my weekly phone calls with Grandma Rose became anchors of stability in a life that felt constantly in flux. She'd want to know every detail about my work, asking questions that showed she was carefully tracking the technical aspects of what we were trying to accomplish. Her genuine curiosity about renewable energy technology surprised me at first, but I gradually realized that her interest stemmed from a deep understanding of how innovation could create positive change in the world. She'd grown up during World War II, when necessity had driven rapid technological advancement, and she'd witnessed the transformation of rural America through electrification, mechanization, and communication technologies. To her, my work on solar energy was simply the latest chapter in humanity's ongoing effort to solve complex problems through ingenuity and determination. This perspective helped me see my own contributions as part of a larger historical narrative, rather than just abstract technical challenges. The startup world was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Success was measured not just by individual achievement, but by collective progress toward ambitious goals that often seemed impossible until they suddenly weren't. My colleagues came from diverse backgrounds and brought perspectives that challenged my assumptions about how problems should be approached. There was Miguel, a mechanical engineer from Mexico City, whose understanding of materials science was intuitive and profound. There was Priya, a software developer from Bangalore, who could write elegant code that made complex calculations seem effortless. And there was James, a business development specialist from Detroit, who'd grown up in the automotive industry but believed passionately that electric vehicles represented the future of transportation. Working alongside these brilliant minds pushed me to become better than I'd ever imagined possible. The technical challenges we faced required not just knowledge but creativity, persistence, and the ability to collaborate across disciplines in ways that my traditional engineering education hadn't fully prepared me for. But I discovered that my small-town background had given me certain advantages that my more cosmopolitan colleagues sometimes lacked. I was comfortable with practical problem-solving, accustomed to making do with limited resources, and unafraid of getting my hands dirty when theoretical solutions needed real-world implementation. After 6 months at SolarTech, I was assigned to a project that would define my early career and ultimately change my relationship with my family back home. We were developing a distributed solar grid system specifically designed for rural communities that lacked access to reliable electricity. The technology itself was sophisticated, but the implementation required understanding the practical constraints of small-town infrastructure, limited budgets, and conservative attitudes toward new technology. My background suddenly became an asset, rather than a limitation. I could anticipate the concerns that rural customers would have about solar installations, understand the economic pressures that would influence their decision-making, and communicate with them in language that felt familiar rather than condescending. Dr. Martinez assigned me to lead community outreach efforts, a role that required traveling to small towns throughout the Pacific Northwest to explain our technology and gather feedback from potential customers. These trips were professionally rewarding but emotionally complicated. Every small farming community I visited reminded me of home, triggering waves of homesickness that I hadn't expected. I'd find myself comparing the rolling wheat fields of eastern Washington to the landscapes of rural Colorado, or noticing how the challenges facing small-town America were remarkably similar regardless of geography. The economic pressures, the aging populations, the struggle to attract young people back after they left for college, all of these themes echoed the conversations I'd grown up hearing around Grandma Rose's dinner table. During one particularly successful community presentation in a town called Spokane Valley, I called Grandma Rose to share the excitement of seeing rural families embrace solar technology that could reduce their energy costs and increase their energy independence. Her response surprised me with its depth of understanding about both the technical and social implications of what we were accomplishing. She'd been following news coverage of renewable energy developments, she told me, and had even started researching investment opportunities in clean technology companies. At 78 years old, she was teaching herself about technologies that many people half her age found intimidating. But more than that, she understood how my work connected to values she'd always held dear: self-reliance, environmental stewardship, and the belief that innovation should serve ordinary people rather than just wealthy elites. That conversation marked a turning point in how I understood my own career trajectory. I'd been thinking about my work primarily in terms of technical challenges and professional advancement, but Grandma Rose helped me see it as a continuation of the values she'd instilled in me throughout my childhood. The solar installations we were designing for rural communities weren't just business opportunities. They were tools for helping small towns become more economically viable and environmentally sustainable. As my second year at SolarTech progressed, my role expanded to include more responsibility for customer relationships and strategic planning. The company was growing rapidly, attracting investors and expanding into new markets. But we maintained the collaborative culture that had drawn me to the organization initially. Dr. Martinez began involving me in high-level discussions about product development and market strategy, treating my input with the same respect she showed to colleagues with decades more experience. This professional recognition was gratifying, but it also created new pressures. The startup environment demanded constant learning, long hours, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. There were weeks when I barely left the office, surviving on takeout food and too much coffee while working to meet deadlines that seemed impossible until we somehow achieved them. The pace was exhilarating but exhausting, and I sometimes wondered if I was sacrificing too much personal life for professional success. My family back home struggled to understand the demands of my career. During phone calls, they'd express concern about my work-life balance, suggest that I was pushing myself too hard, and hint that a more traditional job might offer better long-term stability. These conversations were well-intentioned but frustrating, because they revealed how little my family understood about the entrepreneurial world I'd chosen to enter. Only Grandma Rose seemed to grasp that the intensity of startup life was temporary, a necessary investment in building something that could have lasting impact. She'd lived through the Great Depression and understood that meaningful achievement often required short-term sacrifices in service of long-term goals. When I'd complain about working weekends or missing social events because of project deadlines, she'd remind me that every generation faces periods when extraordinary effort is required to seize extraordinary opportunities. Her support became even more crucial during my third year at SolarTech, when the company faced its first serious crisis. A major investor pulled out of a funding round, citing concerns about market conditions and competitive pressures. Almost overnight, we went from confident growth mode to survival mode, implementing cost-cutting measures and stretching every dollar while scrambling to find new sources of capital. Several of my colleagues left for more stable positions at established companies, and I was tempted to follow their example. The startup world's inherent uncertainty felt less romantic when it threatened my ability to pay rent and student loans. But Dr. Martinez convinced me to stay, offering equity compensation to offset reduced salary and arguing that the crisis represented an opportunity to prove our technology's value when economic pressures made efficiency innovations more important than ever. The decision to stay proved wise when SolarTech not only survived the funding crisis, but emerged stronger and more focused. The experience of operating with limited resources forced us to prioritize our most promising technologies and streamline operations in ways that improved our competitive position. My role during this period expanded significantly, as I took on responsibilities that would normally be handled by more senior staff who'd left the company. When new funding finally materialized 18 months later, I found myself promoted to senior engineer with equity participation that made me a genuine stakeholder in the company's success. The promotion came with increased salary, expanded responsibilities, and the kind of professional recognition that validated my decision to pursue opportunities outside conventional career paths. Grandma Rose was thrilled when I called to share the news. She understood the significance of equity compensation in ways that surprised me, asking detailed questions about vesting schedules and valuation metrics that suggested she'd been educating herself about startup financing. Her enthusiasm reminded me that achievement feels most meaningful when it's shared with people who understand its significance. The promotion also marked a shift in how my family viewed my career choices. The financial stability and professional recognition were difficult to dismiss as youthful idealism, and gradually the criticism and concern gave way to grudging respect. Even Uncle Mike, who'd been most vocal in questioning my decision to leave Colorado, began asking detailed questions about renewable energy technologies and their potential applications in rural construction projects. But success also created new challenges. The demands of senior leadership required skills that had nothing to do with engineering expertise. I found myself managing teams, negotiating contracts, and making strategic decisions that affected not just my own career but the livelihoods of colleagues who'd become close friends. The responsibility was both exciting and intimidating, particularly for someone who'd never expected to be in leadership positions so early in her career. Dr. Martinez became an invaluable mentor during this transition, teaching me that technical competence was necessary but not sufficient for effective leadership. She helped me understand that managing innovative teams required different approaches than traditional hierarchical management, emphasizing collaboration, creative problem-solving, and the ability to inspire people to pursue ambitious goals despite uncertain outcomes. These leadership lessons proved crucial as SolarTech began expanding into international markets. My experience with rural communities made me a natural choice to lead our expansion into developing countries where reliable electricity access remained a major challenge. The work required not just technical expertise but cultural sensitivity, diplomatic skills, and the ability to adapt our technologies to local conditions and economic constraints. My first international assignment took me to rural Guatemala, where we were piloting solar microgrids for communities that had never had consistent electricity access. The project was technically complex but socially transformative, providing power for schools, medical clinics, and small businesses that could dramatically improve quality of life in isolated villages. Working in Guatemala reminded me of conversations I'd had with Grandma Rose about the responsibility that comes with privilege and education. She'd grown up during the Depression, understanding that individual success meant little unless it contributed to broader social progress. Seeing our solar installations bring electricity to families who'd never had reliable power felt like fulfilling the values she'd instilled in me throughout my childhood. The Guatemala project's success led to additional international opportunities. Over the following year, I traveled to Kenya, Bangladesh, and Peru, each time adapting our technologies to local conditions, while learning about different approaches to sustainable development. These experiences broadened my perspective in ways that formal education never could have, showing me how engineering solutions must be grounded in deep understanding of social, economic, and cultural contexts. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was the gradual evolution of my relationship with Grandma Rose, from that of granddaughter and grandmother to something more like professional colleagues. She'd continued educating herself about renewable energy technologies and markets, following industry developments with the same attention she'd once devoted to agricultural commodity prices. During our weekly calls, she'd share insights about investment trends and market opportunities that often proved remarkably prescient. Her questions about our business strategy were increasingly sophisticated, and I began to realize that her decades of experience managing farm finances and making investment decisions had given her analytical skills that transferred directly to evaluating technology companies. This professional dimension of our relationship felt like a natural evolution of the mentoring she'd provided throughout my childhood and education. She'd always encouraged me to think critically about complex problems, to question conventional wisdom, and to trust my judgment even when it led to unpopular conclusions. Now she was applying those same principles to understanding the industry I'd chosen to enter, creating a foundation for conversations that were both personally meaningful and professionally valuable. As my fourth year at SolarTech began, the company had grown from a small startup to a mid-sized organization, with significant market presence and expansion plans that seemed limited only by our ability to execute them effectively. My role had evolved to include strategic planning responsibilities that required thinking several years ahead about technology trends, market opportunities, and competitive positioning. This long-term planning perspective made me acutely aware of how rapidly the renewable energy sector was changing, and how important it would be to stay ahead of technological developments rather than simply responding to them. The work was intellectually challenging in ways that reminded me why I'd been drawn to engineering in the first place, but it also required business acumen and strategic thinking skills that I'd never expected to need when I was studying thermodynamics and materials science. The success I was experiencing professionally created new complexities in my relationship with my family back home. The financial rewards and professional recognition were undeniable, but they also highlighted how far I'd traveled from the values and lifestyle that had shaped my upbringing. There were moments when I felt like I was living two completely different lives, connected only by my weekly phone calls with Grandma Rose and occasional visits home that felt increasingly like trips to a foreign country. These feelings of disconnection were particularly acute during family gatherings, where conversations about my work felt forced and awkward. My cousins had followed more traditional paths, getting married, buying houses, and starting families while building careers in familiar industries. Their lives seemed grounded in ways that mine sometimes felt untethered from any permanent foundation. But Grandma Rose continued to provide the emotional anchor that kept me connected to my roots while supporting my professional growth. She understood that success required sacrifices, but insisted that achievement should enhance rather than replace the relationships and values that mattered most. Her ability to bridge the gap between my small-town background and cosmopolitan career became increasingly important as the distance between those worlds continued to grow. During one particularly difficult period, when I was questioning whether professional success was worth the personal costs it seemed to require, she shared a story I'd never heard before about her own youth. After high school, she'd had the opportunity to move to Denver and work for an accounting firm that would have offered better pay and more interesting work than anything available in rural Colorado. She'd ultimately decided to stay home and marry Grandpa, a choice she'd never regretted, but one that had required giving up possibilities she'd sometimes wondered about. Her point wasn't that I should make different choices than she had, but that every generation faces decisions about how much to sacrifice for security versus how much to risk for opportunity. That conversation helped me understand that my struggles with balancing ambition and belonging were part of a larger human experience rather than evidence that I'd made wrong choices. Grandma Rose's ability to provide this kind of perspective became one of the most valuable gifts she gave me during those years when professional success was creating personal uncertainty about who I was becoming and where I truly belonged. The first sign that something was changing in my family dynamics came during Grandma Rose's 80th birthday celebration in May. I'd flown home from Seattle specifically for the occasion, bringing with me a carefully selected gift that I'd been excited to share with her, a tablet computer, loaded with educational apps about renewable energy, financial markets, and global environmental initiatives. I'd spent weeks curating content that would align with her growing interests in technology and sustainable development. The party was held at the community center in Millfield, the same venue where our family had celebrated countless milestones over the years. The familiar decorations, potluck dishes, and gathering of relatives should have felt comforting, but I noticed subtle tensions that hadn't been present during previous visits. Conversations seemed to pause when I entered rooms, and there were whispered discussions that stopped abruptly when I approached. My Aunt Jennifer, who was my father's older sister and had always been the most vocal critic of my career choices, seemed particularly agitated throughout the celebration. She'd appointed herself as the primary organizer of the party, taking charge of decorations, catering, and even the guest list with an authority that felt somewhat presumptuous. Jennifer had always been domineering, but there was something different about her behavior that day, a possessive quality in how she positioned herself as Grandma Rose's primary caregiver and decision-maker. During the gift-giving portion of the evening, I presented the tablet to Grandma Rose with genuine enthusiasm, explaining how she could use it to follow news about renewable energy developments, track her investment portfolio, and even video chat with me when our usual phone calls weren't convenient. Her eyes lit up with the same curiosity and excitement I'd always loved about her, and she immediately began exploring the device with the fearless enthusiasm of someone who'd never been intimidated by new technology. But Jennifer's reaction was swift and sharp. She practically snatched the tablet from Grandma Rose's hands, examining it with obvious disapproval, before setting it aside with a dismissive comment about how complicated these devices were for elderly people. The suggestion that Grandma Rose couldn't handle technology was not only insulting, but demonstrably false, given that she'd been successfully using her computer for years to research investments and stay informed about current events. When I tried to demonstrate some of the tablet's features to show how user-friendly they were, Jennifer interrupted with a comment that made the entire room uncomfortable. She suggested that I was being inconsiderate by giving Grandma Rose gifts that would require learning new skills at her age, implying that I was selfishly pushing my own interests without considering what would actually be helpful for an elderly person. The accusation stung because it was so fundamentally wrong. I'd chosen the tablet specifically because I knew Grandma Rose would appreciate having easier access to the information she was already seeking through her computer. But Jennifer's criticism carried the implicit suggestion that I was out of touch with my grandmother's real needs, that my life in Seattle had made me insensitive to the practical considerations that mattered to elderly people in rural communities. Grandma Rose tried to diffuse the tension by thanking everyone for their thoughtful gifts and changing the subject, but I could see that she was uncomfortable with the confrontation. Later, when I had a few minutes alone with her, she apologized for Jennifer's behavior and assured me that she was genuinely excited about learning to use the tablet. But there was something in her expression that suggested this wasn't the first time Jennifer had made decisions about what was appropriate for her. The remainder of my visit was colored by similar incidents. Jennifer seemed to be monitoring my interactions with Grandma Rose, inserting herself into conversations and making subtle but persistent suggestions about what topics were appropriate for discussion. When I tried to share updates about my work on international solar projects, Jennifer would redirect the conversation to local family news or health concerns, implying that technical discussions were too stressful for someone of Grandma Rose's age. Most troubling was Jennifer's apparent assumption that she had the authority to make decisions about Grandma Rose's daily schedule and social interactions. She'd taken to referring to herself as Grandma Rose's primary caregiver, despite the fact that Grandma Rose was still living independently and managing her own affairs with the same competence she'd always demonstrated. The language Jennifer used suggested that she viewed Grandma Rose as increasingly dependent rather than simply aging, a perspective that seemed to diminish her autonomy and decision-making capacity. During my last evening at home, I had a private conversation with Grandma Rose that revealed the extent of the changes that had been occurring during my absence. She confided that Jennifer had been visiting more frequently over the past year, often arriving unannounced and staying for hours to help with tasks that Grandma Rose had been handling perfectly well on her own. These visits were framed as acts of concern and devotion, but they seemed to be gradually undermining her independence and creating a narrative that she needed more supervision than she actually required. More concerning was Jennifer's apparent interest in Grandma Rose's financial affairs. She'd been asking detailed questions about investment accounts, insurance policies, and estate planning, justifying these inquiries as necessary preparation for potential future needs. But Grandma Rose felt uncomfortable with the assumption that she couldn't manage her own finances, particularly since she'd been successfully handling complex investments for decades and had a better understanding of financial markets than most people half her age. The conversation revealed that Jennifer had been subtly but persistently questioning Grandma Rose's relationship with me, suggesting that my busy career in Seattle meant I didn't have time for family responsibilities, and that it was unrealistic to expect support from someone who lived so far away. These comments were poisonous because they contained just enough truth to be persuasive while completely misrepresenting the actual nature of our relationship. Jennifer's campaign of subtle manipulation was particularly insidious because it was conducted under the guise of loving concern. She wasn't making direct accusations or creating obvious conflicts, but rather planting seeds of doubt about my reliability and commitment to family, while positioning herself as the devoted relative who could be trusted to prioritize Grandma Rose's best interests above all other considerations. When I returned to Seattle after that visit, I felt deeply unsettled by the dynamics I'd observed. The changes in my family's behavior weren't dramatic enough to address directly, but they represented a shift in relationships that had been stable for decades. I found myself wondering if Jennifer's increased involvement in Grandma Rose's life was genuinely motivated by concern, or whether there were other factors influencing her sudden dedication to caregiving responsibilities. My unease deepened over the following months as I noticed subtle changes in my regular phone conversations with Grandma Rose. She seemed more tired than usual, less enthusiastic about discussing current events or my work projects, and occasionally distracted by background conversations that suggested she wasn't alone during our calls. When I asked about her tablet and whether she was finding it useful, she mentioned that Jennifer had suggested it might be too complicated for regular use, and had recommended putting it away until she felt more confident about learning new technology. The idea that Grandma Rose would be intimidated by technology was so contrary to everything I knew about her that I began to suspect Jennifer was actively discouraging her from using the gifts I'd given her. This suspicion was confirmed during a conversation in late summer when Grandma Rose mentioned that Jennifer had been helping her organize her important papers and had suggested that some of her investment activities might be too risky for someone her age. The suggestion that Grandma Rose's investment strategy was inappropriate was particularly galling because her approach had been consistently successful over many years. She'd never been a reckless investor, but she'd also never been content to accept the minimal returns that traditional savings accounts offered. Her willingness to research and invest in companies she believed in had allowed her to build a substantial portfolio that provided both financial security and personal satisfaction. But Jennifer's intervention seemed designed to undermine this independence and create a narrative that Grandma Rose needed more conservative financial management, presumably with Jennifer's guidance and oversight. The implications were troubling not just for Grandma Rose's autonomy, but for the broader family dynamics that had always been built on respect for her wisdom and decision-making capacity. During the fall, I began to notice that my phone calls with Grandma Rose were becoming less frequent and more constrained. She'd apologize for cutting conversations short, explaining that she had appointments or commitments that hadn't been part of her routine during previous years. When I asked about these activities, she'd mentioned that Jennifer had arranged various social events, medical appointments, and household maintenance tasks that seemed to fill her calendar with obligations she'd never needed before. The gradual erosion of our regular communication pattern was particularly painful because our weekly phone calls had been such an important source of connection and support for both of us. These conversations had provided me with emotional grounding during the challenging early years of my career, while giving Grandma Rose insight into a world of technological innovation and professional achievement that she found genuinely fascinating. But Jennifer's increasing involvement in Grandma Rose's life seemed to be systematically disrupting the relationships and routines that had sustained her for years. The changes were implemented gradually and justified as necessary improvements, but the cumulative effect was to make Grandma Rose more dependent on Jennifer's guidance and less connected to the broader network of relationships that had always been sources of strength and independence. My cousin Brad, who was Jennifer's son and had always been somewhat irresponsible with money and career choices, began appearing more frequently in family conversations during this period. He'd been working sporadically in construction and had a history of ambitious plans that never materialized into sustainable income. But according to family gossip, he'd suddenly developed a strong interest in helping his grandmother with household maintenance and property management tasks. Brad's newfound devotion to family responsibilities seemed suspiciously convenient, given his historical pattern of avoiding work and expecting financial support from relatives. His sudden presence in Grandma Rose's life coincided with Jennifer's increased involvement, creating a coordinated effort to position themselves as indispensable caregivers while subtly undermining the relationships that had previously provided Grandma Rose with emotional support and intellectual stimulation. The most disturbing aspect of these developments was how skillfully Jennifer was orchestrating changes that appeared benevolent while actually serving her own interests. She'd created a narrative that Grandma Rose needed more help and supervision than she'd required before, then positioned herself and her son as the family members who were willing to provide that assistance. This approach made it difficult for anyone to object without seeming uncaring or selfish. My attempts to address these concerns directly were frustrated by the geographic distance between Seattle and Colorado, as well as by the subtle nature of the manipulation that was occurring. When I tried to discuss my observations with other family members, they either hadn't noticed the changes or viewed them as positive developments that demonstrated Jennifer's admirable commitment to caring for an aging relative. The situation reached a crisis point in early November, when I called Grandma Rose to discuss Thanksgiving plans and discovered that Jennifer had already made arrangements for the holiday without consulting the extended family. Instead of the traditional gathering at Grandma Rose's farmhouse, Jennifer had decided that the celebration should be held at her own home, with a smaller guest list and a more manageable format that would be less stressful for someone of Grandma Rose's age. This decision was particularly troubling because it broke with decades of family tradition and removed Grandma Rose from the central role she'd always played in organizing holiday celebrations. The farmhouse had been the natural gathering place for our extended family, and Grandma Rose had always taken pride in hosting elaborate meals that brought together multiple generations around her dining room table. Jennifer's assumption that she could unilaterally change these arrangements revealed the extent to which she'd begun making decisions about Grandma Rose's life without consulting her or considering her preferences. When I expressed concern about this development, Jennifer responded with a defensive explanation about the practical difficulties of expecting an elderly person to handle the stress of hosting large family gatherings. But when I spoke with Grandma Rose privately about the Thanksgiving plans, she confided that she'd been looking forward to hosting the traditional celebration and was disappointed by Jennifer's decision to move it elsewhere. She'd been quietly preparing for weeks, planning menus and organizing the house for the kind of multi-generational gathering she'd always enjoyed. Jennifer's intervention had not only disrupted these plans, but had done so without meaningful consultation about what Grandma Rose actually wanted. The Thanksgiving situation crystallized my growing concerns about Jennifer's motivations and methods. Her actions were consistently framed as protective and caring, but they systematically undermined Grandma Rose's autonomy and isolated her from relationships and activities that had always been sources of joy and fulfillment. The pattern suggested a deliberate campaign to create dependence rather than genuine concern for an elderly relative's well-being. My decision to fly home for Thanksgiving despite Jennifer's modified plans created additional tension within the family. Jennifer seemed to interpret my presence as criticism of her caregiving efforts, and she made several pointed comments about how difficult it was to maintain consistency in an elderly person's routine when family members who lived far away made unexpected demands on their time and energy. The holiday gathering itself was uncomfortable and stilted, lacking the warmth and spontaneity that had always characterized our family celebrations. Jennifer controlled the conversation, redirecting discussions away from topics she deemed inappropriate for Grandma Rose, and monopolizing attention with detailed accounts of her caregiving activities. Grandma Rose seemed subdued and tired, a stark contrast to her usual role as the vibrant center of family gatherings. During a brief moment when I was alone with Grandma Rose, she squeezed my hand and whispered an apology for how different everything felt. She seemed to understand that changes were occurring but felt powerless to resist them without creating family conflict that would ultimately make her situation more difficult. Her resignation was heartbreaking because it represented such a departure from the strong, independent woman who'd always been the family's moral and intellectual leader. The conversation that followed was one of the most important we'd ever had, though neither of us realized it at the time. Grandma Rose confided that she'd been thinking about her legacy and what she wanted to accomplish with the resources she'd accumulated over decades of careful saving and investing. She'd always believed that wealth should be used to create opportunities for the next generation, but she was increasingly concerned about ensuring that her resources would be used wisely rather than simply inherited by whoever happened to be geographically closest when she died. Her comments about legacy and responsibility were subtle but unmistakable in their implications. She was beginning to recognize that Jennifer's increased involvement in her life might be motivated by factors other than genuine concern for her well-being, and she was starting to think about how to protect her autonomy and ensure that her resources would be used according to her values rather than someone else's priorities. When I returned to Seattle after that Thanksgiving visit, I carried with me a deep sense of unease about the direction my family dynamics were heading. The changes I'd observed were still subtle enough to be dismissed as normal adjustments to an aging relative's needs, but the pattern was becoming clear to anyone who cared to look closely. Jennifer was systematically positioning herself as Grandma Rose's primary caregiver and decision-maker, while gradually isolating her from relationships and activities that had always been sources of independence and joy. The most troubling aspect of the situation was how effectively Jennifer was using the language of care and concern to justify actions that actually served her own interests. By framing her increased involvement as necessary assistance for an aging relative, she made it difficult for anyone to object without seeming selfish or uncaring. This approach was particularly effective because it contained enough truth to be persuasive, while completely misrepresenting the actual nature of Grandma Rose's needs and capabilities. As winter progressed, my phone conversations with Grandma Rose became increasingly constrained and infrequent. She'd apologize for being unavailable when I called, explaining that Jennifer had scheduled various appointments and activities that seemed to fill her days with obligations she'd never needed before. When we did manage to connect, our conversations were often interrupted by background noise that suggested she wasn't alone, and she seemed hesitant to discuss topics that had always been central to our relationship. The gradual erosion of our communication pattern was particularly painful, because it represented the loss of something that had been precious to both of us for so many years. Our weekly phone calls had provided emotional grounding during the challenging early years of my career, while giving Grandma Rose insight into a world of technological innovation and professional achievement that she found genuinely fascinating. But Jennifer's campaign of subtle manipulation was succeeding in disrupting the relationships and routines that had sustained Grandma Rose for decades. The changes were implemented gradually and justified as necessary improvements, but the cumulative effect was to make her more dependent on Jennifer's guidance and less connected to the broader network of relationships that had always been sources of strength and independence. The situation was becoming increasingly urgent, but I felt powerless to intervene effectively from 3 states away. My attempts to discuss my concerns with other family members were met with polite dismissal or suggestions that I was being overly suspicious about Jennifer's obviously caring efforts to help an aging relative. The geographic distance that had allowed me to pursue my career dreams was now preventing me from protecting the person who'd made those dreams possible in the first place. The phone call that changed everything came on a frigid February morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my Seattle office. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and the voice on the other end belonged to someone I'd never heard of before. Drive. Patricia Huang from Denver Presbyterian Hospital. Ms. Williams, I'm calling about your grandmother, Rose Williams. She was brought to our emergency department this morning after experiencing what appears to be a mild stroke. She's stable now, but she specifically asked me to contact you directly. The world seemed to tilt sideways as I processed this information. A stroke. Grandma Rose, who'd always been so vital and sharp, was lying in a hospital bed 3 states away. But what struck me most was that she'd asked the doctor to call me directly, suggesting she'd been conscious and coherent enough to make that request, despite whatever medical crisis had brought her to the emergency room. How is she now? I managed to ask, already mentally calculating flight times and rearranging my schedule to get home as quickly as possible. She's doing well, all things considered. The stroke was relatively minor, and her cognitive function appears to be intact. She's been asking for you repeatedly, which is actually a positive sign. However, I should mention that there's been some confusion about her emergency contact information. The family members who brought her in seem to have different ideas about who should be making medical decisions. Even in my state of shock and worry, I caught the subtle implication in Dr. Huang's words. There was family conflict about Grandma Rose's care, and somehow she'd managed to request that I be contacted despite whatever obstacles might have been put in place by other relatives. I was on a plane to Denver within 4 hours, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios and best-case hopes, while trying to process the reality that the woman who'd been my anchor and inspiration for so many years was facing a serious health crisis. The flight seemed to take forever, and I found myself staring out the window at the snow-covered Rocky Mountains, remembering all the times Grandma Rose and I had looked at those same peaks from her front porch while discussing my dreams and plans for the future. Denver Presbyterian Hospital was a maze of corridors and elevators that all seemed to lead to the same sterile waiting areas filled with worried families and the constant hum of medical equipment. When I finally found the cardiac unit where Grandma Rose was being treated, I was surprised to encounter Jennifer and Brad camped out in the family lounge, surrounded by the kind of elaborate care packages and flower arrangements that suggested they'd been there for quite some time. Jennifer's reaction to my arrival was immediate and territorial. She stood up from her chair with the kind of dramatic flourish that suggested she'd been preparing for this confrontation since the moment she'd learned I was coming. "Emma, I'm so glad you could make it," she said with false sweetness that didn't mask the underlying hostility in her voice. "Though I should let you know that the medical team has been very clear about limiting visitors. Rose needs complete rest, and too much stimulation could be dangerous for someone who's just experienced a stroke." The implication was obvious. I was an unwelcome disruption to the careful medical management that Jennifer had presumably been coordinating during my absence. But something in her tone suggested this wasn't just about medical protocols. There was a possessive quality to her words that made me suspect she'd been using Grandma Rose's illness as an opportunity to further consolidate her control over the situation. "I'd like to see her," I said simply, ignoring the subtle threat in Jennifer's warning about overstimulation. "The doctor who called me said she'd been asking for me specifically." Jennifer's expression hardened slightly. and I could see Brad shifting uncomfortably in his chair. There was clearly something about Dr. Huang's call that had disrupted whatever narrative they'd been constructing about Grandma Rose's condition and care needs. "Well, yes, she's been somewhat confused since the stroke," Jennifer said carefully. The medical team explained that it's normal for stroke patients to have difficulty with memory and decision-making. She's been asking for all sorts of people, including some who've been dead for years. I wouldn't read too much into any specific requests she might have made. The suggestion that Grandma Rose was cognitively impaired and that her request to see me was a product of confusion rather than genuine desire was both insulting and strategically convenient for Jennifer. If Grandma Rose's judgment was compromised, then Jennifer could justify making decisions on her behalf without considering her actual preferences or wishes. But when I finally made it past Jennifer's gatekeeping and into Grandma Rose's hospital room, I found her sitting up in bed, looking frail but entirely lucid. Her eyes lit up when she saw me, and she reached out with surprising strength to grasp my hand. "Emma, sweetheart, I'm so glad you're here. I was worried they wouldn't let you know what happened." Her voice was slightly slurred from the stroke, but her words were clear and coherent. More importantly, her grip on my hand was firm and purposeful, not the confused clutching of someone whose cognitive abilities had been compromised by her medical crisis. "How are you feeling, Grandma?" I asked, settling into the chair beside her bed and trying to assess her condition without alarming her with too much obvious scrutiny. "Tired, mostly, and frustrated by all the fuss everyone's been making. You'd think I was dying instead of just having a little health scare." She glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Jennifer's been here constantly, making all kinds of decisions about my care without asking what I actually want. She's even been talking to the doctors about moving me to some kind of assisted living facility once I'm discharged." The revelation that Jennifer was already making plans for Grandma Rose's future living arrangements was deeply troubling. It suggested that she was using the stroke as an opportunity to implement changes that would serve her own interests, rather than focusing on what would actually be best for Grandma Rose's recovery and long-term well-being. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice low to avoid attracting Jennifer's attention from the hallway where she was undoubtedly monitoring our conversation. "I want to go home to my own house and recover in my own bed," she said firmly. "I want to tend my garden and sit on my porch and live my life the way I've been living it for 80 years. I don't want to be treated like an invalid just because I had a medical episode that thousands of people survive every year." Her clarity and determination were reassuring, but they also highlighted the extent to which Jennifer had been misrepresenting her condition and capabilities to justify taking control of her care decisions. The stroke had been serious enough to require hospitalization, but it hadn't transformed her into the confused, dependent person that Jennifer was describing to medical staff and family members. Over the next several hours, I spent as much time as possible with Grandma Rose, despite Jennifer's persistent attempts to limit my access based on various medical protocols that seemed to apply only to me and not to her or Brad. During our conversations, Grandma Rose shared information that revealed just how systematic Jennifer's manipulation had become during the months I'd been away. She'd been gradually isolated from friends and activities that had always been important to her, with Jennifer justifying these restrictions as necessary precautions for someone of her age. Her financial accounts had been reviewed by Jennifer under the guise of helping her organize her affairs, and there had been persistent suggestions that some of her investment decisions were too risky for someone in her 80s. Most disturbing was Jennifer's apparent campaign to convince other family members that Grandma Rose was becoming increasingly dependent and unable to manage her own affairs. These conversations had been conducted without Grandma Rose's knowledge or participation, creating a narrative about her declining capabilities that bore little resemblance to reality. "She's been telling everyone that I'm getting senile," Grandma Rose confided during one of our brief private moments, "making it sound like I can't remember things or make good decisions anymore. But Emma, my mind is as sharp as it's ever been. I know exactly what she's doing and why she's doing it." The revelation that Grandma Rose was fully aware of Jennifer's manipulation tactics was both reassuring and heartbreaking. It meant that her cognitive abilities were intact, but it also meant that she'd been enduring months of systematic undermining, while feeling powerless to resist without creating family conflict that would ultimately make her situation worse. "What can I do to help?" I asked, feeling the weight of responsibility for someone who'd always been my protector and advocate. "I need you to know that I've been planning for this," she said quietly, glancing again toward the door to make sure we weren't being overheard. "There are things in motion that Jennifer doesn't know about. Legal arrangements that I made months ago because I could see where this was heading." Before she could elaborate, Jennifer appeared in the doorway with a nurse in tow, explaining that visiting hours were over and that Grandma Rose needed rest. The interruption felt deliberately timed to prevent us from having the detailed conversation that Grandma Rose had been trying to initiate. That evening, I checked into a hotel near the hospital, planning to spend several days in Denver to better understand Grandma Rose's condition and care needs. But my plans were disrupted by an unexpected phone call from someone I'd never heard of before. Margaret Chen, an attorney who explained that she'd been working with Grandma Rose on confidential legal matters for several months. "Ms. Williams, your grandmother asked me to contact you if she ever became unable to communicate freely with you. She was very specific about the circumstances that should trigger this call, and I believe we've reached that point." The mysterious nature of this contact was intriguing but also concerning. What kind of legal arrangements had Grandma Rose made that required secrecy and contingency planning? And why had she felt the need to establish these safeguards without telling me or other family members what she was doing? Margaret's office was located in downtown Denver, in one of those elegant older buildings that suggested established credibility and discretion. When I arrived for our meeting the next morning, I found myself in a conference room with leather-bound books and oil paintings that conveyed exactly the kind of traditional legal authority that someone of Grandma Rose's generation would trust and respect. "Your grandmother is a remarkable woman," Margaret began, settling into her chair with the kind of professional composure that suggested she'd handled similar situations many times before. "She came to me last October with very specific concerns about potential family conflicts regarding her estate and her care as she aged. She wanted to ensure that her wishes would be respected regardless of what other family members might prefer." The timeline was significant. October was when Jennifer's manipulation had become most obvious, when the Thanksgiving arrangements had been changed without consultation, and when Grandma Rose's isolation from friends and activities had become most systematic. It appeared that she'd been far more aware of what was happening than anyone had realized. "What kind of arrangements did she make?" I asked, trying to prepare myself for revelations that might be surprising or complicated. "Several important ones," Margaret replied, opening a thick file folder that contained documents I couldn't identify from across the conference table. "First, she established a comprehensive advance directive that specifies exactly how she wants medical decisions made if she becomes unable to communicate her preferences. This document specifically names you as her healthcare proxy, overriding any assumptions that family members who live nearby would automatically have that authority." The significance of this decision was enormous. It meant that despite Jennifer's attempts to position herself as Grandma Rose's primary caregiver and decision-maker, the legal authority for medical choices rested with me. This arrangement would undoubtedly create conflict with Jennifer, but it reflected Grandma Rose's determination to maintain control over her own care, rather than allowing others to make decisions based on their own priorities. "Second," Margaret continued, "she established an irrevocable trust that transfers the majority of her assets to you, effective immediately. This trust was funded 6 months ago, which means the assets are already legally yours, regardless of what her will might say when it's eventually read." The room seemed to spin slightly as I processed this information. An irrevocable trust meant that Grandma Rose had already given me her investment portfolio, her savings accounts, and presumably other valuable assets while she was still alive. The implications were staggering, both financially and in terms of what this revealed about her assessment of family dynamics. She did this because she was concerned about potential pressure from family members who might try to influence her estate planning decisions, Margaret explained. "The trust structure ensures that her wishes will be respected regardless of what happens to her health or what other people might prefer." The foresight and sophistication of these arrangements was remarkable. Grandma Rose had recognized that her stroke or other health crises might be used by Jennifer to justify taking control of her finances and care decisions. By establishing legal protections in advance, she'd ensured that her actual preferences would be respected rather than overridden by family members who claimed to know what was best for her. "There's more," Margaret said, producing another document from the file. She also prepared a detailed letter explaining her reasoning for these decisions. She asked me to share it with you if circumstances ever made it necessary. The letter was written in Grandma Rose's distinctive handwriting, and reading it felt like having a conversation with her during one of our most intimate and important discussions. She explained that she'd been watching Jennifer's behavior for months, recognizing the subtle manipulation tactics and understanding where they were likely to lead. She'd consulted with Margaret not because she was angry or vengeful, but because she wanted to ensure that her resources would be used according to her values rather than someone else's priorities. The letter made clear that she'd always intended for me to inherit the majority of her estate, but the trust structure was designed to protect that inheritance from potential challenges or manipulation. Most importantly, the letter expressed her confidence in my judgment and her belief that I would use her resources wisely to continue the values and principles she'd always tried to instill in me. She wrote about her pride in my accomplishments and her conviction that I would honor her memory by using her gift to create positive change in the world. "When will she tell the family about these arrangements?" I asked, still struggling to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. "She won't," Margaret replied simply. "The trust is already in effect, and the healthcare directives are legally binding. The family will learn about these arrangements when they become relevant, but there's no requirement for advanced disclosure." This meant that Jennifer's plans to control Grandma Rose's care and finances were already undermined by legal arrangements she knew nothing about. The irony was perfect. While Jennifer had been maneuvering to position herself as the responsible family member who deserved to inherit Grandma Rose's wealth, that wealth had already been transferred to the granddaughter she'd been systematically trying to alienate. Over the following days, I split my time between visiting Grandma Rose in the hospital and working with Margaret to understand the full scope of the legal arrangements that had been put in place. The trust was more substantial than I'd ever imagined, including not just savings and investments, but also the farm property and various other assets that represented decades of careful financial management. But more than the financial implications, these arrangements represented Grandma Rose's final expression of the values she'd always tried to teach me. She'd used her resources to create opportunities for me to continue the work I was passionate about, while ensuring that her legacy would be preserved according to her own vision rather than someone else's interpretation of what she would have wanted. Grandma Rose's recovery progressed steadily, and within a week she was ready to be discharged from the hospital. The question of where she would go for her continued recovery became a source of intense family conflict, with Jennifer advocating for a residential care facility that would provide professional supervision and me supporting her expressed desire to return to her own home. The healthcare proxy document resolved this conflict definitively. As her legal representative for medical decisions, I had the authority to support her choice to recover at home with appropriate support services rather than being institutionalized against her will. Jennifer's reaction to this revelation was explosive, but the legal arrangements were unambiguous and legally binding. The process of arranging home care services and support for Grandma Rose's recovery gave me an opportunity to spend extended time with her, rebuilding the close relationship that Jennifer's manipulation had tried to undermine. During these conversations, she shared more details about her decision to establish the trust and the factors that had influenced her estate planning. She'd been inspired partly by watching my career success and recognizing that I had the skills and values necessary to manage substantial resources responsibly. But she'd also been motivated by her concern that traditional inheritance patterns might not serve her values or my interests, particularly if family conflicts arose around her estate. "I wanted to give you these resources while I could still enjoy watching you use them," she explained during one of our conversations on her front porch, where we'd returned to our old routine of discussing current events and future plans. Too many people wait until they're dead to be generous, and then they never get to see the good that comes from their gifts. The wisdom of this approach became clear as we worked together to plan how the trust resources would be used. Rather than simply receiving a windfall inheritance after her death, I was able to collaborate with her on strategic decisions about investments, charitable giving, and long-term planning that reflected both her values and my professional expertise. we decided to establish a foundation focused on supporting rural entrepreneurs and clean energy initiatives, combining her lifelong commitment to rural communities with my professional background in renewable energy technology. The foundation would provide grants and mentorship for small-town innovators who were working on projects that could benefit both local economies and environmental sustainability. The announcement of the foundation's creation was made at a small ceremony at Grandma Rose's farm, attended by friends and neighbors who'd known her for decades. The event was a celebration of her values and her vision for using wealth to create positive change, but it also served as a subtle revelation to family members about the extent of her resources and her decisions about how they would be used. Jennifer's attendance at the ceremony was awkward and tense, as she began to understand that her assumptions about inheriting Grandma Rose's wealth had been fundamentally incorrect. The trust arrangements meant that the assets she'd been coveting were already legally mine, and the foundation structure ensured that they would be used for purposes that aligned with Grandma Rose's values rather than Jennifer's priorities. The months following Grandma Rose's stroke and recovery were a period of profound transformation in my relationship with my family and my understanding of my own responsibilities. The trust resources provided financial security that allowed me to take bigger risks in my career and personal life, but they also came with the weight of honoring Grandma Rose's legacy and values. I made the decision to leave my position at SolarTech Innovations and return to Colorado to manage the foundation full-time. This choice surprised many of my Seattle colleagues, who couldn't understand why I would leave a successful career in the technology industry to work in rural economic development. But the opportunity to combine my professional skills with Grandma Rose's vision for creating positive change felt like the natural evolution of everything she'd taught me about using privileges and resources responsibly. The foundation's first major initiative was a grant program for rural clean energy projects, providing funding and technical support for small communities that wanted to develop solar, wind, or other renewable energy capabilities. The program was designed to address both economic and environmental challenges, creating local jobs while reducing dependence on fossil fuels and supporting energy independence. Working directly with rural communities reminded me of the values that had shaped my childhood and the practical problem-solving skills that Grandma Rose had always emphasized. The foundation's approach was grounded in respect for local knowledge and priorities, providing resources and expertise while allowing communities to maintain control over their own development decisions. The success of these initiatives validated Grandma Rose's confidence in my ability to manage substantial resources effectively. More importantly, it demonstrated that her decision to transfer her wealth during her lifetime had created opportunities for positive impact that would have been impossible if she'd waited until her death to make her resources available. As the foundation's work expanded and gained recognition, I found myself becoming a spokesperson for innovative approaches to rural economic development and environmental sustainability. The platform provided opportunities to advocate for policies and practices that aligned with Grandma Rose's values, while building on my professional expertise in renewable energy technology. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. Jennifer's attempts to isolate me from Grandma Rose and position herself as the responsible family member who deserved to inherit had backfired completely. Instead of succeeding in her manipulation, she'd prompted Grandma Rose to take legal action that protected both her autonomy and her legacy, while ensuring that her resources would be used according to her actual values rather than someone else's priorities. The family dynamics never fully recovered from these revelations, but the conflict had served to clarify relationships and priorities in ways that were ultimately healthy. Grandma Rose was able to spend her remaining years with dignity and independence, surrounded by people who respected her judgment and supported her choices rather than trying to control her decisions. She lived for 3 more years after her stroke, remaining mentally sharp and physically capable until a peaceful death at age 83. Her final years were marked by the satisfaction of watching the foundation's work flourish and seeing her resources create exactly the kind of positive change she'd always envisioned. The will reading that followed her death was a formality, since the trust arrangements had already distributed the majority of her assets according to her wishes. Jennifer's shock at discovering that she would inherit only a small bequest was genuine, but irrelevant, since the legal arrangements were unambiguous and had been in place for years. The foundation continues to operate according to Grandma Rose's vision, supporting rural entrepreneurs and clean energy initiatives while honoring her memory through practical work that creates lasting positive change. Her legacy lives on not through traditional inheritance patterns but through the values and principles she instilled in me and the resources she provided to continue that work. Looking back, I understand that Grandma Rose's most important gift wasn't the money or the property she left me, but the example she set of using resources and privileges responsibly while maintaining the courage to make difficult decisions based on principles rather than convenience. Her willingness to protect her legacy through legal arrangements that others might have found controversial demonstrated the kind of foresight and determination that had always characterized her approach to life. The story of our relationship and her ultimate gift serves as a reminder that real family relationships are built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care for each other's well-being, rather than simply genetic connections or geographic proximity. Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who have the courage to make difficult decisions that serve our long-term interests, rather than our immediate comfort. The phone call from Margaret Chen's office came on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, exactly 1 week after we'd laid Grandma Rose to rest in the small cemetery overlooking the valley where she'd spent her entire life. Her passing had been peaceful, surrounded by the people who truly loved her, but the grief felt like a physical weight that pressed down on everything I tried to do. "Ms. Williams, we need to schedule the formal reading of your grandmother's will," Margaret's assistant explained with professional sympathy. "Mrs. Chen has arranged for the family to gather this Friday at 2 o'clock. She asked me to let you know that there may be some surprises for certain family members." I understood the coded warning in those words. While I knew about the trust arrangements that had already transferred most of Grandma Rose's assets to me, the rest of the family remained unaware of these legal maneuvers. The will reading would be their first indication that their assumptions about inheritance patterns had been completely wrong. The days leading up to the reading were filled with the strange emptiness that follows a major loss. I'd taken a leave of absence from the foundation to handle estate matters and personal grief, but mostly I found myself wandering through Grandma Rose's farmhouse, touching objects that held decades of memories, and trying to process the reality that our weekly phone calls would never happen again. Jennifer had been notably absent during Grandma Rose's final days, claiming that the emotional stress of watching her mother figure decline was too overwhelming for her sensitive nature. This convenient absence had allowed Grandma Rose to spend her last week surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her comfort and happiness, rather than their own inheritance prospects. But Jennifer's interest in family matters revived dramatically once funeral arrangements needed to be made. She suddenly appeared with strong opinions about everything from flower selections to burial plots, asserting her role as the primary family representative, with the kind of authority that suggested she expected to be making similar decisions about estate matters. The funeral had been beautiful and well attended, reflecting the genuine affection that Grandma Rose had inspired throughout her long life. Former students, business associates, neighbors, and friends filled the small church where she'd worshipped for 6 decades, sharing stories that painted a picture of someone who'd touched countless lives through her generosity, wisdom, and unwavering principles. But even during the funeral reception, I'd noticed Jennifer and Brad having whispered conversations with other family members. Conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I approached. There was an undercurrent of anticipation and calculation that felt inappropriate for a gathering meant to celebrate Grandma Rose's life and mourn her passing. Friday afternoon arrived gray and cold, with the kind of late winter weather that makes everything feel subdued and melancholy. Margaret's law office felt more formal than during my previous visits, perhaps because this meeting would be attended by the entire extended family, rather than just me and Grandma Rose's trusted attorney. When I arrived, the conference room was already crowded with relatives I hadn't seen since the funeral. Jennifer sat at the head of the table as if she were chairing a board meeting, flanked by Brad and his sister Melissa. Uncle Mike and Aunt Susan occupied chairs along one wall, while various cousins and their spouses filled the remaining seats around the polished oak table. The atmosphere was tense with expectation and barely concealed greed. I could see family members calculating probable inheritance amounts based on their assumptions about Grandma Rose's wealth and their perceived importance in her life. Jennifer's confident demeanor suggested she had no doubt about her position as the primary beneficiary. Margaret entered with her characteristic professional composure, carrying a leather portfolio that presumably contained documents that would dramatically alter several people's expectations about their financial futures. She took her place at the head of the table and surveyed the assembled family with the kind of neutral expression that experienced attorneys perfect over decades of delivering unexpected news. "Thank you all for coming," she began formally. Rose Williams was a remarkable woman who gave considerable thought to how her estate should be distributed. She wanted her wishes to be clearly understood, so she prepared detailed instructions for this reading. The preliminary formalities felt interminable as Margaret read through legal language about the validity of the will, the appointment of executors, and various technical matters that had little immediate impact on anyone's inheritance expectations. But I could see family members becoming increasingly impatient for the substantive revelations that would determine their financial futures. Rose left specific bequests to several individuals and organizations that were important to her, Margaret continued, consulting her documents with deliberate precision. To the Millfield Public Library, where she volunteered for 30 years, she left $10,000 for the purchase of new books and educational materials. Similar bequests followed for Grandma Rose's church, her longtime housekeeper Mrs. Patterson, and several neighbors who'd provided friendship and support during her final years. These generous but modest gifts reflected her lifelong pattern of recognizing people who'd contributed to her happiness and well-being. Jennifer shifted impatiently in her chair as these smaller bequests were announced, clearly eager to move past the preliminary gifts to the substantial inheritance she expected to receive. Brad was checking his phone under the table, apparently unable to maintain focus during legal proceedings that didn't immediately benefit him. "To my nephew Brad Williams," Margaret read, "who showed such interest in helping with household maintenance during my final years, I leave my collection of garden tools and my heartfelt appreciation for his assistance." The silence that followed this announcement was profound and uncomfortable. Brad's face went through several expressions as he processed the reality that his inheritance consisted of rusty shovels and pruning shears rather than the substantial financial windfall he'd been anticipating. "To my niece Jennifer Patterson," Margaret continued without acknowledging the shocked stillness in the room, "who demonstrated such concern for my welfare and took such an active interest in my daily care, I leave my china cabinet and dining room set, along with my appreciation for her dedication." Jennifer's reaction was immediate and explosive. She stood up so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, her face flushing red with indignation and disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she declared, her voice rising to a pitch that made everyone else in the room uncomfortable. "There must be some mistake. Mother Rose always said that family takes care of family, and I'm the one who's been taking care of her for years." Margaret remained professionally calm despite Jennifer's outburst, consulting her documents as if angry interruptions were a normal part of estate readings. But there was something in her expression that suggested she was prepared for exactly this reaction and had strategies for managing it. "Mrs. Patterson, please allow me to finish reading the will before we discuss any concerns you might have," Margaret said firmly. "There are additional provisions that I think you'll find relevant to your questions." Jennifer remained standing, her hands clenched into fists as she glared at Margaret with obvious hostility. The rest of the family sat in stunned silence, apparently struggling to understand how the inheritance distribution could be so different from their expectations. "To my beloved granddaughter Emma Williams," Margaret continued, "who had the courage to follow her dreams while never forgetting the importance of family relationships, I leave my personal effects, photographs, and furniture, along with my confidence that she will use these mementos to remember our time together with joy rather than sadness." Even though I knew about the trust arrangements, hearing Grandma Rose's words read aloud brought tears to my eyes. Her message was both a loving farewell and a reminder of the principles she'd always tried to instill in me about balancing personal ambition with family responsibility. But Jennifer's reaction to this bequest was even more dramatic than her response to her own inheritance. She pointed an accusing finger at me across the conference table, her voice shaking with rage and indignation. "This proves it," she shouted. "Emma manipulated her. She convinced a sick old woman to leave everything to her instead of the family members who actually took care of her. This will is invalid because it was made under duress." Margaret allowed Jennifer's accusations to hang in the air for a moment, before responding with the kind of professional authority that comes from decades of handling similar family conflicts. When she spoke, her voice was measured but firm. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand that you're disappointed by these provisions, but I can assure you that Rose Williams was of completely sound mind when she executed this will. Furthermore, there are additional legal arrangements that I believe will address your concerns about the distribution of her estate." The mysterious reference to additional arrangements captured everyone's attention, including mine despite my knowledge of the trust structure. Margaret opened a second folder and withdrew documents that I recognized as copies of the irrevocable trust agreement that had been established months earlier. "What many of you don't know," Margaret explained, "is that Rose Williams established an irrevocable trust 6 months before her death, transferring the majority of her financial assets to her chosen beneficiary while she was still alive and in excellent health." The room erupted in confused voices as family members tried to understand the implications of this revelation. An irrevocable trust meant that whatever assets had been transferred were already legally owned by someone else, making them unavailable for traditional inheritance distribution, regardless of what anyone might prefer. This trust was created specifically because Rose was concerned about potential family conflicts regarding her estate, Margaret continued, raising her voice to be heard over the confused discussions happening around the table. She wanted to ensure that her wishes would be respected regardless of what objections might be raised after her death. Jennifer's face had gone completely white as she began to understand that her plans to inherit Grandma Rose's wealth had been undermined by legal arrangements she'd known nothing about. The trust structure meant that whatever assets had been transferred were already beyond her reach, no matter what arguments she might make about manipulation or undue influence. "Who received these trust assets?" Uncle Mike asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "Emma Williams," Margaret replied simply. "Rose transferred approximately $1.2 million in investment accounts, savings, and other financial assets to Emma through the irrevocable trust structure." The silence that followed this announcement was deafening. Every person in the room was processing the magnitude of this revelation and its implications for their own expectations about inheritance. The trust arrangement meant that the substantial wealth they'd been anticipating would go to someone who'd never asked for it, and who'd been systematically excluded from family decision-making for months. But Jennifer's reaction transcended mere disappointment and moved into the realm of genuine fury. She began pacing around the conference room, gesturing wildly as she voiced accusations that grew more dramatic and desperate with each passing minute. "This is theft," she declared. "Emma convinced Rose to sign papers she didn't understand. She took advantage of an elderly woman's confusion and loneliness. This trust is fraudulent, and we're going to challenge every aspect of it." Margaret listened to these accusations with professional patience before responding with information that would undermine Jennifer's claims more effectively than any legal argument could have done. "Mrs. Patterson, I have video recordings of Rose Williams explaining her decision to establish this trust," Margaret said calmly. "These recordings were made at her specific request, and they clearly demonstrate her mental competence and her understanding of the legal arrangements she was making. The existence of video evidence was something I hadn't known about, but it represented exactly the kind of thorough preparation that had always characterized Grandma Rose's approach to important decisions. She'd anticipated that her estate planning might be challenged, and had taken steps to document her reasoning and mental state. Furthermore, Margaret continued, the trust was established well before any signs of cognitive decline or health problems that might have affected her judgment. The timing alone makes claims of manipulation or undue influence extremely difficult to support." Brad finally spoke up from his position at the far end of the table, his voice carrying the kind of petulant whining that had characterized his approach to disappointment since childhood. "This isn't fair," he complained. "We're the ones who lived here and took care of her. Emma was off in Seattle living her fancy life while we were dealing with all the family responsibilities. Why should she get rewarded for abandoning her family?" The accusation that I'd abandoned my family was particularly galling because it misrepresented both my relationship with Grandma Rose and the circumstances that had led to Jennifer's increased involvement in her life. My weekly phone calls, regular visits, and genuine emotional connection had meant far more to Grandma Rose than the kind of superficial assistance that Brad had provided when it served his own interests. Margaret seemed to anticipate this line of argument because she withdrew another document from her files, one that I recognized as a letter Grandma Rose had written to explain her estate planning decisions. Rose also prepared a detailed explanation of her reasoning for these arrangements, Margaret announced. She specifically asked that this letter be read if family members questioned her decisions or suggested that geographical distance had affected her relationship with Emma. The letter was written in Grandma Rose's distinctive handwriting, and hearing Margaret read her words aloud felt like receiving a final message from beyond the grave. She'd written about the importance of supporting family members who demonstrated integrity and ambition, rather than simply rewarding those who happened to live nearby or who claimed to provide care. She specifically addressed the accusation that I'd abandoned my family by pursuing career opportunities in Seattle, explaining that she'd always encouraged me to follow my dreams precisely because she believed that personal fulfillment and professional success would enable me to make greater contributions to the world. Most powerfully, she wrote about her concerns regarding family members who seemed more interested in her financial assets than in her personal well-being, and her determination to ensure that her wealth would be used according to her values rather than someone else's priorities. The letter also revealed details about Jennifer's behavior that I hadn't known about, including attempts to convince Grandma Rose that I was too busy with my career to maintain meaningful family relationships. These manipulation tactics had backfired because they'd revealed Jennifer's true motivations and had prompted Grandma Rose to take legal action to protect both her autonomy and her legacy. When Margaret finished reading the letter, the conference room was silent, except for the sound of Jennifer's angry breathing and the uncomfortable shifting of family members who were beginning to understand that their assumptions about inheritance and family loyalty had been completely wrong. Jennifer made one final attempt to salvage her position, threatening legal action and claiming that she had evidence of mental incompetence that would invalidate both the will and the trust arrangements. But Margaret's response was swift and decisive. "Mrs. Patterson, I should inform you that Rose specifically anticipated such challenges and provided me with extensive documentation of her mental competence, including medical evaluations, financial records, and detailed discussions of her reasoning for these estate planning decisions. Any legal challenge would face overwhelming evidence of her cognitive capacity and voluntary decision-making." The threat of protracted legal proceedings clearly intimidated Jennifer, particularly since she lacked the financial resources to sustain expensive litigation against well-documented legal arrangements. Her bluster gradually deflated as she realized that her options for challenging Grandma Rose's decisions were extremely limited. The formal reading concluded with Margaret explaining the practical steps that would be necessary to transfer the remaining estate assets and finalize the legal proceedings. Most of these arrangements were straightforward, since the major financial assets had already been distributed through the trust structure. As family members began filing out of the conference room, their conversations were subdued and awkward. The revelation that their inheritance expectations had been completely wrong created an atmosphere of embarrassment and resentment that would probably affect family relationships for years to come. Jennifer paused at the door to deliver one final accusation, her voice heavy with bitterness and defeat. "You may have fooled Rose into giving you her money," she said, pointing at me with obvious hatred, "but you can't fool the rest of us. We know what kind of person manipulates elderly relatives for financial gain." I let her words hang in the air without responding, partly because anything I said would only escalate the conflict, and partly because I understood that her anger came from disappointment and embarrassment rather than genuine conviction. She'd spent months positioning herself as Grandma Rose's devoted caregiver, only to discover that her efforts had been transparent and ineffective. After the family left, Margaret and I spent another hour discussing the practical implications of the inheritance and the foundation work that would continue Grandma Rose's legacy. The conversation was both professionally necessary and emotionally comforting, providing closure to a process that had begun months earlier with Grandma Rose's careful estate planning. "Your grandmother was one of the most thoughtful clients I've ever worked with," Margaret observed as we wrapped up our business. She understood that wealth creates both opportunities and responsibilities, and she wanted to ensure that her resources would be used by someone who shared her values and judgment. The drive back to Grandma Rose's farmhouse took me through the familiar countryside where I'd spent so many childhood summers, But everything looked different now that I knew I was seeing it through the lens of ownership and responsibility rather than simple nostalgia. The trust arrangements had made me the steward of resources that could create meaningful change in rural communities like this one. But they'd also given me the weight of honoring Grandma Rose's memory through wise and principled decision-making. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the work of organizing the foundation and developing programs that would reflect Grandma Rose's values while addressing contemporary challenges facing rural America. The renewable energy initiatives we'd discussed during her final years became the foundation's primary focus, but we also added programs supporting rural entrepreneurship, educational opportunities, and environmental conservation. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Jennifer's attempts to manipulate Grandma Rose and position herself as the deserving heir had prompted exactly the legal arrangements that prevented her from achieving her goals. Her transparent greed and controlling behavior had revealed her true character and had motivated Grandma Rose to take protective action that ensured her legacy would be preserved according to her actual wishes. But beyond the satisfaction of seeing justice prevail, I felt the profound responsibility that comes with inheriting someone's life work and accumulated wisdom. The trust assets weren't just money. They represented decades of careful saving, thoughtful investing, and principled decision-making by someone who'd always used her resources to create positive change in the world. The Foundation's first major initiative was a solar energy program for rural schools, providing both cost savings for educational budgets and hands-on learning opportunities for students interested in renewable energy technology. The program combined my professional expertise with Grandma Rose's lifelong commitment to education and community development. Working directly with rural school districts reminded me of the values that had shaped my childhood and the practical problem-solving skills that Grandma Rose had always emphasized. These communities faced real challenges with aging infrastructure and limited budgets, but they also possessed the kind of innovative spirit and collaborative approach that could make clean energy projects successful. The success of the school solar program led to requests from other rural organizations seeking similar assistance. Within 6 months, the foundation was working with farmers' cooperatives, small businesses, and community organizations throughout Colorado and neighboring states, providing both financial support and technical expertise for renewable energy projects. Each project reinforced my understanding of why Grandma Rose had been so passionate about supporting rural communities and encouraging technological innovation. These areas possessed enormous potential for clean energy development, but they often lacked access to the capital and expertise necessary to implement sophisticated projects. The Foundation's approach was grounded in respect for local knowledge and priorities, providing resources and expertise while allowing communities to maintain control over their own development decisions. This collaborative model reflected Grandma Rose's belief that effective philanthropy should empower people to solve their own problems rather than imposing external solutions. As the Foundation's work expanded and gained recognition, I found myself becoming a spokesperson for innovative approaches to rural economic development and environmental sustainability. The platform provided opportunities to advocate for policies and practices that aligned with Grandma Rose's values, while building on my professional expertise in renewable energy technology. The speaking engagements and media interviews were professionally rewarding, but they also created opportunities to share Grandma Rose's story and the principles that had guided her approach to wealth and responsibility. Her example of using resources to create positive change rather than simply accumulating assets for their own sake provided a powerful counter-narrative to conventional assumptions about success and inheritance. During one particularly meaningful speaking engagement at a rural development conference, I shared the story of how Grandma Rose had recognized my potential before I understood it myself, and had provided support that enabled me to pursue opportunities that would have been impossible otherwise. The audience of community leaders and development professionals responded with enthusiasm, recognizing the broader implications of her approach to mentorship and resource allocation. The Foundation's work also created opportunities to reconnect with rural communities in ways that reminded me of my childhood experiences, while allowing me to contribute professional skills and resources that could make a genuine difference. The combination of nostalgia and purpose felt like the fulfillment of everything Grandma Rose had always hoped I might accomplish. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of managing Grandma Rose's legacy was the ongoing discovery of values and principles that she'd instilled in me through decades of patient teaching and example. Every decision about foundation programs required me to consider what she would have wanted and how her approach to problems might guide contemporary solutions. The trust assets provided financial security that allowed me to take risks and pursue initiatives that might not have been possible in a traditional career context. But more importantly, they came with the responsibility to honor Grandma Rose's memory by using her gift to continue the work she'd always believed was most important. 3 years after the will reading, I received an unexpected letter from Jennifer, the first communication we'd had since the angry confrontation in Margaret's office. The letter was brief and somewhat stilted, but it contained an apology for her behavior during Grandma Rose's final months, and an acknowledgement that she'd allowed her disappointment about inheritance to overshadow her genuine grief for someone she'd loved. The apology felt sincere, though it came too late to repair the damage that her manipulation had caused to family relationships. But it provided some closure to a painful chapter, and reminded me that grief and disappointment can make people behave in ways that don't reflect their better natures. The foundation continues to operate according to Grandma Rose's vision, supporting rural entrepreneurs and clean energy initiatives, while honoring her memory through practical work that creates lasting positive change. Her legacy lives on not through traditional inheritance patterns, but through the values and principles she instilled in me and the resources she provided to continue that work. Looking back on the entire experience, I understand that Grandma Rose's most important gift wasn't the money or property she left me, but the example she set of using resources and privileges responsibly while maintaining the courage to make difficult decisions based on principles rather than convenience. Her willingness to establish protective legal arrangements that others might have found controversial demonstrated the kind of foresight and determination that had always characterized her approach to life. She understood that real love sometimes requires making choices that serve long-term interests rather than immediate comfort or family harmony. The Foundation's work has expanded far beyond what either of us originally envisioned, but every project reflects the values and priorities that guided her throughout her life. Her belief in the importance of education, environmental stewardship, and community self-reliance continues to shape decisions about where to focus resources and how to structure programs for maximum impact. The story of our relationship and her ultimate gift serves as a reminder that meaningful inheritance is about much more than financial assets. The most valuable legacy includes the wisdom, principles, and example that enable the next generation to make positive contributions to the world, while honoring the memory of those who made their opportunities possible. Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who have the courage to make difficult decisions that protect our long-term interests, rather than our immediate comfort. Grandma Rose's estate planning wasn't just about money. It was about ensuring that her values and vision would continue to create positive change long after she was gone. Her final gift was the opportunity to carry forward her legacy through work that combines personal fulfillment with meaningful service to others. The trust assets made this work possible, but the real inheritance was the understanding of how privilege and resources should be used to benefit others, rather than simply accumulating wealth for its own sake. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.